without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium Hari Jones.
And yes, it's true, notwithstanding appearances, I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. Anytime my Marines would complain about getting a haircut, I told them that once I got out, I was not going, well, once I retired, I was not going to get my hair cut either. And I promised them that I would not get it cut for at least 10 years. It's been 20 years now, so any day you can see me with a high and tight. Not. Let's begin our discussion today on African American units during World War I. There was one complete African American division, the 92nd Division, with 4 infantry regiments, 3 artillery regiments, 1 engineer regiment, 3 machine gun battalions, 1 signal battalion, 1 mortar battery, and support elements. There was 1 provisional division, the 93rd Division, with 4 National Guard infantry regiments. There were 16 pioneer infantry regiments, 3 service regiments, 92 service battalions, 26 service companies, 2 regular infantry regiments, and 2 regular cavalry regiments. You notice how I kind of paused when I said cavalry? I'm a son of a Baptist minister, so often when I say cavalry, I'll say Calvary. So you have to watch that. So don't correct me if you hear that today. The 24th Infantry Regulars served stateside. The 25th Infantry Regulars served in Hawaii. The 9th Cavalry Regulars served in the Philippines. The 10th Cavalry Regulars served stateside along the Mexican border. In August 1918, the 10th Cav and the 35th Infantry Regulars, not an African American regiment, fought at the Battle of Ambos Nogales, where German military advisors fought alongside Mexican soldiers. This land battle was the only one during World War I where German soldiers fought American soldiers in North America. It is often reported that during World War I, African American soldiers were given to the French because General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, didn't want them fighting with the AEF. Some reports characterized General John Blackjack Pershing as a racist who did not have confidence in African American soldiers. However, General Pershing, a combat veteran of the 10th Cavalry, wrote that African American soldiers were, quote, reliable and courageous, close quote. And notably, of the over 150 African American company-sized units or larger, only 4 National Guard regiments were attached to French divisions. Of the over 200,000 African American soldiers who served in Europe from 1917 to 1919, less than 20,000, less than 10%, were given to the French. As a consequence of the race policies of the Wilson administration and the segregationist South, all African American units were confronted with institutional racism within the War Department and the United States Army. However, the experiences of individual soldiers and units varied drastically. Soldiers serving in the Service of Supply, SOS units, reported the most overt discrimination and abuses. The soldiers that reported the least discrimination and abuses were the members of the 4 regiments assigned to French divisions, and the soldiers of the 370th Infantry. The 8th Illinois National Guard reported the least among those 4. The 8th Illinois National Guard was designated as the 370th Infantry in December 1917. From 1898 to 1916, it was the only African American National Guard regiment in the country. Of the 6 African American regiments in the military in late July 1917 when the National Guards were called up. The National Guard regiments were called up. There were 4 regular and 2 National Guard regiments at that time. The 8th is the only regiment commanded exclusively by African American officers. The experiences of the officers and soldiers of the 8th Illinois National Guard, the Fighting 8th, during World War I reflects its unique history and composition. It was not a regiment comprised of men seeking to become citizens, the rights of citizens to participate in American democracy. It was a regiment of citizen soldiers who participated in American democracy and who sought to clear a path for democracy for other Americans while fighting in Europe to make the world safe for democracy. When we examine soldiers, when we examine Marines, when we examine warriors, it is important to understand how they view themselves. So we begin today with an examination of how the members of the 8th Illinois National Guard were educated about their own military history. One of the most important individuals within African American military history, in particular at that time, and I want to emphasize, I said at that time, in 1899 and early 20th century, African American military men had actually a better understanding of their military history than we typically do today. And one of the most important individuals in this history was Major Martin Delaney. Major Delaney wrote, "But the time shall yet come when the name of the despised, neglected American patriot, in spite of American prejudice, shall rise superior to the spirit that would degrade it and find its place on the records of merit and fame." 2 soldiers in the 8th wrote a history of the 8th Regiment in 1899, McCard and Turnley. McCard and Turnley wrote, "Ever since Crispus Attucks, the world has known that the black man has undaunted courage, that he is obedient to command, that he possesses, thanks to his unfortunate ancestors, a hardy constitution and the faculty of being satisfied with a humble diet. In a word, he is the ideal private soldier. Sherman and Sheridan have testified to this fact. After Appomattox, Lee averred that without the aid of the Negro soldiers, the North could never have conquered him. And General McClellan said, 'Give me an army of black men, and I will defy the world.' But McCard and Turnley go on to say, 'Negroes as officers would be an experiment. Theirs heretofore was to obey, not to command.'" And they're focusing in this book on the history of the 8th and command. Now, their view of history is since Crispus Attucks. For those who don't know Crispus Attucks, he is the first to be killed in the Boston Massacre. So he's the first American patriot to lose his life in what became the American Revolution. Martin Delaney today, if you go to many of our top institutions, our scholars will teach you that Major Martin Delaney was a black nationalist. However, if you read Delaney closely, you won't find that. Now, this you are seeing is a handbill that he handed out in 1863, and I want you to note that he says, "Black National Defenders." He had an office, a recruiting office in Chicago, and he recruited for a number of northern states during the Civil War. Delaney believed that it was in league with the Constitution that they would end the tyranny of slavery. So when he says black national defenders, he's taking an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States because he believes it is essentially anti-slavery. This is a patriots movement. He's not a black nationalist. Indeed, President Lincoln, in February of 1865, would order the commission of Delaney as a regular officer. Of the over 100 African-American officers that served during the Civil War, only one was a regular officer, and those you appreciate that most regular officers at that time were West Point graduates. Delaney is commissioned a major of infantry and commanded the 104th United States Colored Troops, which was never fully staffed, but he was a regimental commander on occupation duty in South Carolina. African-American soldiers in the Civil War, the view that the soldiers in the 8th had of them was that they were conquerors, they were successful, they were victors. They were taught that African-American soldiers in the 25th Army Corps, the only Army Corps in American history commanded by General Godfrey Weitzel, comprised of only African-American regiments, captured Richmond. It was in the newspapers, but I challenge you to find it in a single American history textbook today. But it was well reported, and it's well reported in the official records. General Grant tells you that in his memoirs that it was General Godfrey's 25th Corps that captured Richmond. After the Civil War in Chicago, private militia groups were drilling consistently under the names of the Hannibal Guards, the Hannibal Zouaves, the Chicago Cadets. These are African-American private militias. Now, this is a tradition that predates the Civil War as well, the private militias. Lieutenant Colonel James Hall became the adjutant and executive officer of the 8th Illinois, and he would write, as far back as the 70s, a loyal and patriotic spirit manifested itself in the hearts and minds of a number of colored citizens of Illinois. They would organize the 16th Battalion in 1890. In 1895, it would be the 9th Battalion, and State Representative John C. Buckner was the commander of the battalion. And he actually attaches a rider to the military appropriations bill in the state legislature, and that rider establishes the 9th Battalion as an official part of the Illinois National Guard. When the Spanish-American War began, only regiments were called up. A committee of men from Chicago went to Springfield and met with Governor Tanner, John Riley Tanner, and Governor Tanner told him, if you can raise a regiment, and there's a second call, I'll deploy them. And Tanner went on to say, and every officer will be a colored man. Now, I want you to appreciate that when Governor Tanner does this in 1898, he is a maverick. President McKinley says, what are you doing there in Illinois? But Tanner doesn't. They raise a regiment. The regiment is commanded by Colonel John R. Marshall, a contractor, a builder in the Chicago area. Marshall had been with the battalion early on. And Marshall understands that when this regiment is deployed to Cuba, it's on trial. In fact, he says, I assure you that the officers and men are on guard because we recognize the fact that the colored officers are on trial. If we fail, the whole race will have to shoulder the blame. Marshall would command them mostly on occupation duty from August of 1898 to March of 1899 in Cuba. The Inspector General of the Army there in Cuba, General Joseph C. Breckinridge, Sr., now he is the cousin of John C. Breckinridge, the Confederate general and former Vice President of the United States, but Vice President or General Breckinridge fought with the Confederacy, not so with General Joseph C. Breckinridge. He was a captain in the Union Army during the Civil War. Inspector General Breckinridge would write, it is a shame to muster out of service such a regiment. It is as fine a volunteer regiment as was ever mustered into service. The soldiers and officers of the 8th believed that this was clear evidence that it would never be refuted again that African Americans made good officers. Now, they were wrong about that. But they believed that, and Lieutenant J.W. Curtis, he directed us to something that I always go to. Anytime as a researcher, I always go to the official records. The scholars may say one thing, and the newspapers may say another, but I want to know what the military records have to say. And the statement heretofore, wrote Curtis, made that colored officers could not command colored soldiers will never be made again. Again, that was not accurate, his statement there, but he says, if it is, and this was his advice to later scholars, if it is, our only reply is to point to the 8th and to examine her records as kept in the imperishable archives of the War Department. You go to the records. You go to the records, and when you go to the records, you get a clear view. Corporal W.T. Good wrote a book on the regiment, and he said that this was a triumph. It was a triumph of this regiment over all obstacles and prejudicial barriers, has certainly shaped the future destiny of the Afro-American. As a peaceful citizen, as a brave and courageous soldier, as a leader, and a prominent factor in the vicissitudes of human affairs. From 1900 to 1916, the 8th Illinois National Guard was known as the Negro's West Point. There were no African Americans that graduated in the first 35 years of the 20th century from West Point, and it was very difficult to get officers training. At this regiment, you could get officers training. One of the individuals that left a great record, and in fact it's the collection that we're using at the DuSable and telling the story of this regiment, came from James C. Hall. James C. Hall is in this picture. He enlisted in 1905 with the ambition to become an officer. The regiment was really the pride of the African American community in Chicago. You would mostly see it on Decoration Day. We call it Memorial Day today. You'd mostly see it parading on Memorial Day, on Decoration Day. One of the objectives of its commander, Colonel John Marshall, was to build an armory for the regiment. He made this a primary objective of his. Remember, he's also a contractor. He is able in 1912 to get the state legislature to appropriate funds to build a regiment. He then would resign as the commander. Remember, he's a contractor. Colonel Franklin A. Dennison would take command of the regiment, and a few months after war had broke out in Europe, in the fall of 1914, so war breaks out in the summer of 1914. In the fall of 1914, they lay the cornerstone for the 8th Armory on 35th and Forest, as it was called at that time, in the Bronzeville community of Chicago. This is a big event. This is the only African-American regiment in the country at the time. Governor Edward Dunn is there when they lay the cornerstone. Colonel Franklin A. Dennison. Now, Colonel Franklin A. Dennison is a very interesting character. He is a citizen soldier to be respected. Colonel Dennison graduated from Lincoln University in Missouri. In 1890, he graduated from what we now call Northwestern Law School. However, he passed the bar in 1889, a year before he graduated law school. He was at the top of his class at Northwestern Law School, and the mayor of Chicago, upon graduation, hired him as a district attorney for the city of Chicago. By 1895, he was assistant chief district attorney for the city of Chicago. So this is an extinguished American citizen that's the commander of the regiment in 1915. When they move into the armory. And the crisis, the journal of the NAACP, they would focus on the 8th Illinois and the Chicago community. So Dennison would appear on the cover of the September 1915 crisis. And they would talk about the Chicago community in this, and Dr. W.B. Du Bois is the editor, and one of the things he noted was that as compared with other cities, colored Chicago is noted for its push in independence, its political aggressiveness, and its large number of middle-class working people who are doing well. The 8th Armory is a symbol for African Americans across the country. A symbol of progress, a symbol of what can be done working within the political system. One of the sergeant instructors, he's a regular soldier, that comes to the 8th Armory in 1915 is very important in our story because he becomes the adjutant for the regiment, and his records are what he writes on what they did in the war is what we have at the DuSable and what I use in the exhibit. Sgt John H Patton was a sergeant instructor, and soon after the National Defense Act was signed into law, that's significant because it brings the National Guard into a more federal standing, and the president can call them up and use them with greater flexibility. Also, it provides funding, federal funding for their training and for these instructors. Well, soon after that act was passed, Patton was discharged from the regular army, and Sergeant Patton was a veteran of the war, Philippine insurrection, 1901 in Luzon, 1906 in Leyte. So he's a combat experienced soldier. But he resigns and he is commissioned a captain in the 8th Illinois National Guard, and he becomes the adjutant. Soon after he is commissioned, the 8th Illinois is called up in the summer of 1916 to participate in the Mexican border campaign. They go down to Camp Wilson, San Antonio, Texas. One of the commissioned officers with them at that time is Lieutenant James C. Hall, enlisted as a private in 1905. Now he's a lieutenant in the regiment. They are mustered out of federal service in October of 1916. Early 1917, the Germans lift their restricted submarine warfare and things get to where the Americans are going to get involved. President Wilson goes before Congress, asks Congress to declare war, and he says that the world must be made safe for democracy. Now, I want you to appreciate, to many African Americans across the country, this rang with irony, but not so much in Chicago. These are citizen soldiers participating in the democracy. And tonight we're going to talk about how they viewed their role in this war and in fighting to make the world safe for democracy. African American communities across the country, especially in Chicago, are very enthusiastic about supporting the war effort. Even the radical newspapers of the Chicago Defender, the Journal, the Crisis, they're all supporting the war effort. And the Liberty bonds are sold in the African American community at a very high rate. They are very much in support of the war effort. Also, through lobbying, mostly coming out of the NAACP, an officer training school for African Americans is established in May of 1917 at Camp Fort Des Moines, Iowa. One of the men who goes to Camp Fort Des Moines was the 2nd Battalion Sergeant Major of the 8th Infantry, Anderson F Pitts. He graduated in October of 1917. Now, remember, these are citizen soldiers. So when we declare war on Germany, one of the first things that Lieutenant Hall does is he writes a letter to his senator, Senator James Hamilton Lewis. And he's concerned about his job and his position in his job once he gets out after being called up. He doesn't know how long he's going to be gone, and he's a postman. He's a postal worker, postal carrier. So he writes his senator. His senator goes to the Postmaster General and queries, says, what's going to happen to my constituent if he gets called up? The Assistant Postmaster General writes back to Senator Lewis and says he's going to have the same position. Nothing will be affected. So don't tell him not to worry about it. And so Senator Lewis writes to Lieutenant Hall, to Postman Hall, and tells him not to worry about it. Again, these are citizen soldiers participating in the American democracy. But by June of 1917, the 8th hasn't been called up. We've declared war. There's mobilization going on, but the 8th hasn't been called up. And so Lieutenant Hall wants to make sure he's a part of the action. So he again writes to his senator, and he says, as Senator Lewis, how can I get into this officer training school? I want to get in the officer training school. So Senator Lewis writes him back and says, well, this is the protocol. This is who you contact so that you can get in. Well, before he has an opportunity to apply to officer training school, the National Guard, the 2 African-American regiments are called up. The 15th New York. Now, the 15th New York National Guard, it was established in the summer of 1916. It's a very young regiment. It has 5 African-American officers. They're called up, and the 8th Illinois National Guard is called up. The 8th Illinois, all of the officers are African-American officers, distinguishing it in that way from the 15th. But also what really distinguishes it from the 15th New York is its military history. It has a combat history. It has a history of deployment. It has a military history. In one way, we could call it the 1st Division of the National Guards, of the African-American National Guards. It's the 1st. Hall is soon promoted. Right after the call-up, he's promoted to captain and named the company commander of Company H. There's a bit of anxiety in the regiment in August of 1917, September 1917, because they're drilling on the streets of Chicago, while other National Guard units from Illinois are being sent down to Camp Logan, Texas, outside of Houston, Texas. The opinion of many of the soldiers and officers in the 8th is because of a race riot that involved the 24th Infantry Regulars in August of 1917. So they're in the opinion that there's some hesitancy about it, and maybe they're not going to go down to Camp Logan at all. However, Governor Loudon is very clear. He wants all of his Illinois soldiers together. The 33rd Division, the Illinois 33rd National Guard Division, is in Camp Logan. So they send them to Camp Logan. The advance party had left in August, but the 2,166 soldiers with 167 African-American officers, they do not arrive until October. And Captain Hall, when he arrives, he writes to his mother. And he talks to his mother. He says, you know, when we get down here, behind our tents is really a forest, woods. It's woods. And so he says, we're feeling like lumberjacks, because what they have to do is they have to clear their drill field. There have been drill fields already cleared, so they actually believe that they're being punished in a way. They're not getting to the military side of training. They are, in the words of Captain Hall, lumberjacks. They're clearing the drill field. Also, he points out that you know, he's gone through Houston and what the 24th had done. Now, I want you to point out, the members of the 8th, they're on guard, and they're really, there's a lot of concentration on how well you behave. And Colonel Dennison is a real disciplinarian. He restricts a lot of their movements. But there is still concern that they're down in Texas, and they're in Houston, Jim Crow, Texas. In November of 1917, Governor Loudon goes down there. And they have a huge parade on November 9th. Now, that also coincides with the anniversary of the 9th Battalion being established as a part of the National Guard. So this is actually their 22nd anniversary. And they have a parade in Houston. And Governor Loudon speaks. Now, I want you to appreciate, you got a northern governor going down to Texas. And this is what he says to the folk in Texas. Illinois stands behind her citizens and soldiers, for patriotism knows no race nor creed, no black nor white. 'Tis not judged by the texture of hair, but by blood, real blood. I want you to appreciate the effect this has on the soldiers, that your governor, who is really responsible for your National Guard, he's your commander of your National Guard unit, that he goes down south and he tells them these are American patriots and that Illinois respects them as such. So the soldiers' opinions of themselves, their esteem and their sense that Illinois is going to stand behind them is certain. They are certain that Illinois is going to stand behind them. In December of 1917, the name of the regiment is changed, and the regiment did not like this. They loved being the 8th, the fighting 8th, the 8th Illinois. Colonel Dennison say the Army chief may destroy the identity of my regiment, but they cannot destroy its spirit. The commander of the 33rd Division, General Bell, would give the colors soon after that to Colonel Dennison. Colonel Dennison say, "We will bring these colors back with honor, or we will not come back at all." Meanwhile, while this is going on, there's some serious tension in the Allied command. The British and the French, what they want from the Americans are infantry regiments, infantry companies, and machine gun companies. That's what they want. They want them to really be replacements in their divisions, their battle-worn divisions. General Pershing's not having it. He wants an American command. He wants an American presence. Negotiations gone for quite some time. On January 6, 1918, he tells General Pershing that, we understand your problems. I had a recent conversation that I had with you. I understand your need for replacement. Now, the French in 1917, they had had a mutiny. And as we know, they had suffered severe casualties. They needed replacements. So Pershing makes a compromise. And he decides to send, in the words of temporarily, 4 National Guard regiments he's going to give to the French. And he says that they're without a division. Remember, that provisional division has never stood up as a complete division. But he gives them, initially with the intention of it being temporary, the 4 division. Now, when he does this, there's only one of these National Guard regiments in France. In December of 1917, the 15th New York, redesignated as the 369th, arrived in Brest, France. It's the only one there. And while they're there, mostly what they're doing is stevedore duty and guarding German prisoners. So when you hear the story that you had combat regiments that were doing stevedore duty, they're actually talking about one regiment, the 15th. It's the only combat regiment that had that kind of duty. Meanwhile, while that's happening with the 369th in January of 1918, the 8th is in training. They're training. Now they're doing their military training. This is one of their training records for the week of January 14th, 1918. Intelligence school, grenade school, automatic rifle school, the regular regimental schools, the school of instruction. And they're training. But at the end of this training schedule, they say, what we really want to do is develop esprit de corps. We want to develop esprit de corps. In March of 1918, they moved from Camp Logan, Houston, Texas, to Camp Stewart, Newport News. They're preparing for embarkation. Now, something else that happens while they're at Camp Logan, Newport News, is Major Otis Duncan is promoted to lieutenant colonel. The regimental executive officer, who's a very old soldier, he's in mid-late 60s, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, he's discharged. Oh, actually, he's sent home. He's sent back to Chicago. Duncan is promoted to lieutenant colonel, but Dennison does something else. He now knows that he's going to be attached to a French division. The 93rd Division isn't really a division that's going to be operational. Well, what is he going to need? They're going to need a way to train replacements. So Colonel Dennison comes up with the idea he's going to take Company K of the 8th Illinois and turn it into a depot company. So they would train replacements. And I say this because I've read some scholars say the African Americans had no way of training their replacements. No, they did, especially in the 8th, because Colonel Dennison was forward-looking. And he made Lieutenant Colonel Duncan the commander of the replacement company. They board ship the USS Grant on April 6, 1918. They arrive in Brest, France on April 22nd. Now, the 369th, as I mentioned before, arrived in December. It worked at stevedores and guarding German prisoners. The 370th arrives in April. The 371st arrives in April. The 372nd arrives in April. Those are the 4 National Guard regiments Now, those last two, the 371st and the 372nd, they were put together. They came from, the 371st was mostly battalions and companies from the District of Columbia, Maryland, Cleveland, Ohio, from Massachusetts, and Tennessee. The 372nd was put together on the quick. Though it was a National Guard regiment, it's the officers, none of the officers were African Americans, I want to add, but the officers are National Guard who recruit mostly Southerners. These are mostly African American Southerners who are part of the 372nd. And these regiments, when they arrive, 370th, 371st, and 372nd, when they arrive in France, they go to their French divisions. They go into training the French divisions. They stay in Brest for a little while, but then they head out. With the 370th, they go all the way across the country to the Swiss border, to Grand Villars, where they are attached to the 73rd French Division, and they go into training. When they go into training, they turn in all of their American equipment, including their uniforms. And they get French uniforms. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out when we talk about French equipment. Some of the first units that arrive, the Browning 1895 machine gun was antiquated. So they get Hotchkiss machine guns too. So other American units are getting Hotchkiss machine guns. So often when people say, and they had to get French equipment, well, if you really track it from the quartermaster department, you'll find that a lot of American soldiers early on got French equipment. A lot. In fact, that's a huge issue because we had to stand up this very large army very quickly. And so, yes, they had to turn it all in. The biggest complaint you get from the soldiers, or the officers particularly of the 8th, was that the French, in their mess, it was 2 meals a day, where the Americans is 3 meals a day. And one of the meals that the French said was actually bread and wine. Colonel Dennison wouldn't let the soldiers have any wine, so it was bread and coffee for the Americans. I do want to point out that you did have members of one of the companies, Company F, that did steal some wine. And they were punished accordingly by Colonel Dennison. Colonel Patton said the division were sent French instructors to take charge of instruction in every phase of work to be undertaken later, as well as instruct them in the uses of unfamiliar French rifles, machine guns, grenades, and packs. There was also a restructuring where you actually have with each battalion a machine gun company. So there was a restructuring of the way the unit was organized. Again, they're with the 79th Division for 6 weeks. They're at Grand Villars. And when they leave Grand Villars in their French uniforms, they head to the St. Mihiel sector. And this is when they first go into the trenches. It's actually a rather quiet time in this area, in this sector at the time. So they see no combat. Sergeant Hall writes about this, and he does talk about the German offensive. Now, he points out to his mother time and time again that he can't tell her about military activities. So anytime he talks about something that's happening militarily, he begins with, did you read the papers, or do you read the papers? And then he'll only tell her what's in the papers. So here we are in June of 1918. He's talking about the Great German Drive, which was most in the British sector, between the British sector and the French sector, which is west of where these soldiers are at the time. So he says it's quiet here. And he tells her, I've traveled quite a bit. He's been all the way across the country. In July of 1918, they're transferred. This letter on July 6th, when he writes it, the regiment is being transferred from at that time, when they were in the St. Mihiel sector, they were in the 34th French Division. They're transferred to the 36th French Division on July 6th. And again, he tells his mother, I'm not going to tell you anything military. So he's not telling her this. I'm just telling you this because I know what happened. They're in the 36th. And while with the 36th, they're in the Argonne Forest. And that's where they suffer their first fatality. Private Robert E. Lee. Now, that might sound a little bit ironic to some people. Private Robert E. Lee is the first casualty of the 8th Illinois, the 370th Infantry. July 28th, he writes to his mother, and in this he tells her that we're located in a wood. So now we know he's really talking about the Argonne Forest. He's talking about how lonesome it is there. They're doing PI, physical instruction, in which they're playing baseball. But also he has some bad news for folk back home in Chicago. Colonel Dennison has been replaced. The Army says that it's because of physical reasons, health reasons. The same reason they had given for not keeping Colonel Charles Young in the Army. He had been discharged for health reasons. So many African Americans going like, "Oh, this is not really it." Captain Hall writes that the news is correct. Colonel Dennison has been replaced. And he says the name of our new colonel is Colonel T.A. Rogers. The new colonel, however, is a very fine man, writes Colonel Hall. He is from the regular Army. His home is in Springfield, Illinois. So they took an Illinois man and put him in charge of the regiment. And this is Colonel Roberts, standing next to Colonel Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel Duncan. Now, I want to point out this time, Lieutenant Colonel Duncan, he is the commander of the depot company, Company A. They have over 460 men in that company training replacements. There are many complaints about Colonel Roberts coming from the chaplain of the regiment. Chaplain Braden thinks that this is a plot to get rid of African American officers. And he shares a number of correspondence where Roberts is actually doing some jockeying, trying to get more white officers in the regiment. I want to point out that Roberts is actually unsuccessful. And one of the reasons is because Illinois will not allow it. This is one of the reasons Roberts is not successful. But Roberts is, in the opinion of his officers, a very hard man. And Roberts is trying to get rid of African American officers, but he actually has respect for African American soldiers. He pushes them hard, and some of the criticisms you'll read in Chaplain Braden's book are what I would expect criticisms of a commander who's driving men hard. I'm never satisfied. As a Marine officer, I'd never go in the middle of an operation, "Oh, everything is wonderful. Marines, you're doing a fine job." No, you're not moving fast enough. We want more done. And that's Roberts is very much that way. And so when you listen to the chaplain's analysis of him, it actually sounds a little bit different from the operations officers, the officers in command in the field. They have a very different view. So Roberts is actually thought of very highly by his field officers. Also in this letter, Hall talks about the 365th. The 365th and the 803rd. 803rd is a pioneer regiment. 365th is a part of the 92nd Division. They draw heavily on the community in Chicago. So there's a number of young men that they know, that Hall's mother knows, and he said he's looking out for them, and he hadn't seen them. This is an July 28th letter, and he says he hadn't seen them, that he's still looking out, but he's not away from the headquarters, and he doesn't know. Well, he couldn't tell her if they had really arrived or not. In fact, they had arrived in June of 1917. However, Levi Holliday, the future brother-in-law of Captain Hall, his mother did not get notice that he had arrived till August. And I just put that in there to show that there's a delay. You don't want to report real time the movement of troops. So you wait till after about almost 2 months, 6 weeks, before they actually notified the family that they were in country, they were in Europe. Now the 92nd Division, they are in the AEF. They are in the AEF. They keep American equipment. They keep their American uniforms. So you see photographs of those with the American helmet That's because they're with the AEF. Very different from photographs you'll see with the 4 National Guard regiments, like the 307th, the 8th Illinois, that are attached to French divisions. The 8th is soon transferred to the 10th Division, and they're preparing for a major offensive, that 100 Days offensive. They're preparing for it, and they're transferred to the 10th Division in an area that's going to be very hot. Hall writes a letter to his mother, and he says that, I suppose you read the great offensive. You've read of the Great Offensive. Again, he's referring to what's in the newspapers. But there's something else he says here. It's great business that the Germans are retreating now, and he doesn't believe that we can lose the war. So I want you to appreciate morale is very high in these units at this time in August of 1918, as reflected in Colonel Hall's letter. In September, he writes a letter to his mother. He says, do you read the war news very much? I should imagine it would be very interesting now, as we Americans are making some great gains. Now, I want you to notice what he's saying. We Americans. He might be fighting with a French division, but he's very proud of being an American in the French division and what the AEF is doing as well. It's we Americans. I want you to appreciate that language. We Americans are making great gains. Also at this time, Hall and a number of officers from the 4 National Guard regiments that are attached to the French divisions, they're sent to a liaison school in preparation for this great offensive. And at the liaison school, one of the big concentrations is, I'm a former Marine artillery officer, so fire support coordination. The big concentration is on fire support coordination, and they're working with French artillery. So they want to make sure that everything is in line, that as they go on this offensive, that they are able to get good fire support coordination. So he goes to a school, and he's actually in the school for about 20 days. And liaison is key. Now, this is actually the Lieutenant Harry Allen, took command of Company H while Captain Hall was gone. And in a major offensive, that offensive that breaks the Hindenburg line, Hall isn't there. So Lieutenant Allen is commanding the company, and this is his report. And what's noticeable about the report is that Allen keeps talking about the failure of liaison. Remember, Hall's in a liaison school, so that reminded him that school was very important. The Hindenburg line, breaking the Hindenburg line. Very big event. Very big event, especially for the 8th. And Sergeant Matthew Jenkins. Sergeant Matthew Jenkins is one of the most interesting stories of the regiment. Sergeant Jenkins is a part of Company F. Company F has been detached to a French regiment. So they're actually attached to a French regiment. And they've been assigned, he is assigned the task of joining with a French platoon, taking his 33 Americans. He is the NCOIC. He takes his 33 Americans and join with a French platoon, and they're to take the Hindenburg Cave. Well-fortified position. When they reach the French platoon, they find out that the French platoon commander is a casualty. There are no officers among the French. So the French company commander puts Sergeant Matthew Jenkins in charge. He is now the platoon commander. He has 33 Americans and 57 Frenchmen. The Hindenburg Cave is defended by almost 400 Germans. Shouting and yelling and firing our guns, said Sergeant Jenkins. We were rushing like madmen. We went to the objective, the Hindenburg Cave. In a shorter time than it takes to relate, we were on top of the enemy. And I want to tell you, supermen could have did little less than these boys in destroying everything before them. fighting like demons. Yes, they went a step beyond this. They threw themselves upon those Hun much in the same fashion as a well-trained terrier attacks a rat. No command was necessary. We just fought and won the objective. They take the objective. They run out of ammunition. They run out of supplies. They have no food. They have to defend the cave for 48 hours. No Germans survived this assault, I want to add. So over 300 fatalities among the Germans. 300 fatalities. There are 17 German machine guns there in the cave. These American and French soldiers, led by Sgt Jenkins, trained themselves on the German machine guns, and they repulsed 3 German counterattacks in that 48-hour period using German machine guns and weapons. For his actions, Sgt Jenkins was awarded the Croix de Guerre, and I'm from Oklahoma, so I may not pronounce that well, and the Distinguished Service Cross. But I want to point out something that I found very interesting in the record. I have a list from the official records of the regiment put together by Captain John Patton of every citation for the Distinguished Service Cross in the unit, which was 22, except for Sgt Jenkins. There's absolutely no write-up at all. In fact, the question is, how do I even know what happened, what he did? Well, in the French records, I'm quite confident that we can go and find them. But in the American records, you won't find it, even though that he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. But there's no write-up. Well, Sgt Jenkins actually, in the Library of Congress, you can find his own personal account of what happened in a pamphlet put together after the war in 1919. So that's how I found out about it. But I want to point out, it's very interesting that there is no citation in the American records, even though he was presented the Distinguished Service Cross. Colonel Hall, after he returned to the regiment, they're now ready for that major offensive that will end the war. He writes to his mother, "We are now located in a battle-swept country." They're in Loam. They've driven the Germans in retreat, so now they're beyond the Hindenburg line. They've broken the Hindenburg line, where everything is barren and desolate. The artillery of the French shoots all day and night. The German artillery does likewise. You become accustomed to it, however, and pay no attention to it. On November 4th, 1819, Captain Patton is now a battalion commander. Now I want to point out, how does he become, remember he was the adjutant, right? If you read Chaplain Braden is really angry when Major Charles Hunt is relieved of duty in charge of the 2nd Battalion. And it is true that Colonel Roberts wanted, quote, a white major to replace him. However, he replaces him with Captain Patton. And he also recommends Captain Patton for promotion to major. This is actually an important event in showing that Roberts is someone who knows a good soldier when he sees him. And he recommends Patton to promotion to major. And he makes Patton the battalion commander for the 2nd Battalion. Captain Hall is also in Company H in the 2nd Battalion. And this is the 5-paragraph order. The last 5-paragraph order issued in the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Illinois National Guard, 370th. This is it. And he's telling them where it's a standard 5-paragraph order. And this is that last offensive. The Germans are retreating, and they are in hot pursuit. The 370th, as a part of the 59th French Division, is one of the lead elements in the Allied forces. The lead element in the 59th Division is Battalion Duncan. Now, the term Battalion Duncan, the French would often use the name of the battalion commander to designate the battalion. So if you're searching through records, it's It's Patton Battalion, Stokes Battalion, Duncan Battalion. Duncan's battalion is in hot pursuit. It is the lead element in the French 59th Division, the French 10th Army. And on November the 11th, 1918, they are in Belgium. They've crossed over, they've chased the Germans into Belgium under Lieutenant Colonel Otis Duncan. After the armistice is declared, this is the first time in Europe they go to work doing labor cleaning up the roads and battlefields. And these are their work orders that we actually have in the collection. They're in Sozans. And again, I'm from Oklahoma, so forgive me for my French pronunciation. And in December, they are detached from the French. They are now back with the American commands. The French commander, General Vincendon, wrote, its units of the 370th, the 8th Illinois, fired by noble order, got at times even beyond the objectives given them by higher command. They have always wished to be in the front line, for the place of honor is the leading rank. Now I want to stop here because this is very interesting when you go to a number of scholars influenced by German propaganda and communist propaganda. Yes, in both periods they use this. They often say that African American soldiers are sent to the front lines because they're expendable, because they don't view them, the American commanders, the racist commanders, it's even in the Civil War, you hear this kind of analysis. They're sent in first to get killed because they're expendable. Now, I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. We boast of going in first. Why? Because we're the best. 82nd Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. 101st Airborne goes in first. Why? Because they're the best. Tell the 75th Ranger Battalion, soldiers, you're going in first because you're the worst, and they'll look at you like you are foolish. Why? Because you are foolish. You send your best in first. The place of honor is the leading rank. And fighting with the French, they were in the place of honor, the leading rank. And they were recognized as such. But this would be recognized by an American general or a French general. The leading rank is a place of honor. And that's where they were in this final offensive of the war. And the French recognized their services. This is Colonel Hall's croix de guerre for leadership and courage on the battlefield. Now, what's significant about this, these are African-American officers. This had never happened in American history, decorated African-American officers. By the French, but Americans do it as well. They returned home in February of 1919. And when they get home, this is an iconic photo. You have Major James R. Wright. Major Wright was the head of the medical detachment. Lieutenant Colonel Otis B. Duncan, and Lieutenant William J. Warfield. Now, you notice all three of these officers have the croix de guerre. But you notice there's something extra on Warfield. Warfield has a Distinguished Service Cross. So the American military is recognizing him for his leadership on the battlefield. What is it? For extraordinary heroism in action. Although separated with his platoon from the company, Lieutenant Warfield continued to lead a stubborn resistance against enemy machine gun nests, successfully capturing a gun and killing the crew. After having been severely wounded, he still continued in command, refusing relief until his objective was reached. Recognition for his actions in leadership on the battlefield. This was a huge event in American history. When they returned home to a hero's welcome, February 17th, 1919, these were distinguished American soldiers, citizen soldiers, highly decorated. The regiment was mustered out in March of 1919, reorganized in April of 1919, and Colonel Duncan became the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Patton, the executive officer, and Captain Hall, the adjutant. It is Lieutenant Colonel Patton and Captain Hall that's responsible for most of the information I shared with you today, because we have at the DuSable the official records kept by Captain Hall. We have their chronology of events. We have these orders in the collection. The regiment, 90 killed in action, 53 wounded, 53 died of their wounds, mortally wounded. 370, interesting number, I always like to pay attention to little things, 370th Infantry, 370 wounded. One captured, the one captured was Private Charles Morris, who returned home with the others. These are all Chicago boys who were prisoners of war, returned home. Well-decorated unit, 22 distinguished crosses. Division, 71 croix de guerres. So a well-decorated unit, but it is their victory memorial that speaks volumes to who they are. In the 1920s, they're able to get this monument erected. They're able to make a statement of, this is the first monument to African-American soldiers in the country. It's right there in the Bronzeville community. They renamed the street that the armory is located on for the only officer killed in action, Lieutenant George Giles. So now that's Giles Street today. So it's on, the armory's on 35th in Giles. These are citizens who are very active in the democracy. In 1928, the 1st Congressional District of Illinois, Chicago, elected the first African-American to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1901, Oscar DePriest. From 1943 to 1970, William Levi Dawson, a veteran of World War I, he wasn't in the 370th, he was the first lieutenant in 366th, but he would serve the 1st District in the House of Representatives. This speaks to their power as citizens, as voting citizens. This is their victory. And finally, with the regiment, the 8th Illinois ceased to exist on September 15th, 1940. Its last commander was Colonel Warfield, William J. Warfield. Colonel Warfield at the time was also a state representative, I want to add. The executive officer for the regiment is Lieutenant Colonel James Hall, who retires not only from the Illinois National Guard, but Lieutenant Colonel Hall also retired from the post office. Citizen soldiers. The quintessential citizen soldiers. The motto of the 8th that became the 185th Field Artillery National Guard on September 15th, 1940 was one country, one flag. This is a story of patriots. This is a story of citizen soldiers from Illinois whose service was unique in American history. And it was unique because Illinois recognized its patriots not by the texture of their hair, but by blood, real blood. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so Hari will entertain some questions. Please raise your hand and wait for one of the women in the back to bring you a microphone, because we're video recording this entire thing and we want to make sure we capture your question as well as Hari's answer. So, and I think our first question's right over here.
Thank you for coming. It's very fascinating. How is this, are these stories being integrated into contemporary education?
That's a real challenge. Fortunately, in 2015, a very good book came out, Torchbearers of Democracy by Chad Williams, where he is really using more sources in it. So, like with the Civil War, our best advances is convincing teachers to use primary sources. And I say, when we get scholars who really direct you, and I call Chad Williams a wonderful guide, I never end with a secondary source. So although I'll mention Chad Williams' book, I actually will say, go to his sources. Go to primary sources. So with teaching these stories, it is trying to get teachers and teachers having the time and the developing of curriculum to where primary sources find their way into the classroom. We're in a wonderful digital age where so many primary sources have been digitized, so they're accessible in classrooms across the country, and a number of teachers are doing it. So it's really, for the DuSable now, with what we have in our collection, it's digitizing this wonderful collection so they're accessible to students here in Illinois.
All right, next one's over here. You go, sir.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned when Colonel Roberts took over the unit, that he was trying to get rid of some black officers. Obviously, you recognized their quality later on, but you mentioned Illinois would not allow him to get rid of these officers, and can you explain that further? What mechanism was in place that he was unable to do any of this?
Well, this is an Illinois regiment, and they have political connections. So this is a National Guard regiment, and you just can't arbitrarily come in and get rid of these citizen soldiers who are I'm going to use that, well connected. And you'll hear it even in Braden's message. He says, but Illinois stands behind us. And so you hear it from these officers. That's really where I'm getting it from. They keep saying Illinois stands behind us. And so what you actually find happening is, instead of getting rid of officers in the 8th Illinois, when an African-American officer is gotten rid of in the 15th New York, guess where he goes? The 8th Illinois. He goes to the 8th Illinois. He's actually transferred to the 8th Illinois. So they wind up getting African-American officers. So Roberts, instead of turning it and getting rid of the African-American officers, he's getting more. He's getting more. And again, it's the when we talk about a National Guard unit like this unit, we must understand that this is a politically connected regiment. These are citizen soldiers who are practicing in the democracy. They're not seeking it. Now, that's very different from the majority of African-American soldiers, especially those from the South. Most of those aren't voters. Here we have voters. This regiment was established by a state representative. So this regiment has political clout, and Roberts learns that he has to respect it. And in fact, Roberts learns, I compare often military service to football coaches. You may say African Americans can't play quarterback, but once you get a Cam Newton, you change your mind. Over here.
We're going to do this gentleman first.
Oh, okay.
I was curious, after the war, did the exploits of the 8th encourage more black young men to enlist in the Army?
The 8th Illinois, yes. It's actually quite a unit. In fact, out of the Illinois National Guard, in the Illinois National Guard, you get the two first National Guard generals in American history that are serving actively, General Whitfield and General Jones, Richard L. Jones. They're all coming out of Illinois. So you see the military tradition, the trajectory of the military tradition coming out of the 8th that lasts well into the 20th century. So yes, you do see it in the National Guard unit. Now, service in the regular, I don't so much, I haven't tracked that, but in the 8th Illinois, yes, you see it, and the commanders like Warfield and others, other officers are very active politically as well.
Yeah, your story kind of ends there with September 15, 1940. Of course, 15 months later, we're at war again. Have you followed up anything about the 184th Field, and were they called up in World War II? I guess I'm just interested in how far further you've gone in your research.
You know, and I stopped there mainly because I just couldn't continue for real administrative and reasons, but also because my Hall collection stops there. He actually stops there. When it becomes the 184th, he retires from the National Guard, and so my collection stopped. So that's one of the reasons I stopped there. And yes, they are called up, and the field artillery and having field artillery officers is a really big deal within the the African American military tradition because, you know, a fire direction officer, which I used to be, you know, we're pretty sharp guys, you know. But there's a great deal of esteem associated with this artillery regiment, and then so yes, it does serve it's called up in World War II, and you get General Jones out of the regiment, and General Whitfield. So 2 generals coming out of it, really quite notable.
Okay, if there are no further questions, let's have another round of